Cultural studies is a field that focuses on understanding culture, but it is important to distinguish it from the traditional study of culture in anthropology. While the study of culture in anthropology often looks at how people live and their customs, cultural studies is concerned with symbolic forms and how they create meaning. These symbolic forms include things like language, media, and other cultural products that shape how we see the world. There are several ways to think about culture in cultural studies. First, culture as a tool. Culture helps us navigate our social and cultural lives, giving us ways to understand and interact with the world. Second, culture as language. Language plays a crucial role in creating culture. The words and signs we use shape how we understand the world. 3. Culture as artifacts. Cultural artifacts such as art, music, and literature reflect the values and beliefs of a society. Fourth, culture and power. Culture is deeply tied to power. The way culture is created and shared often reflects the power dynamics within a society. Cultural studies looks at how these different aspects of culture shape our identity as cultural beings. It is an interdisciplinary field that brings together insights from different areas including sociology, psychology, history, and philosophy to explore how culture works. In cultural studies, one of the main ideas is that we are not just biological beings but also cultural beings. This means that our bodies and behaviors are shaped by the culture around us, not just by nature. For example, our ideas about gender roles, race, and sexuality are influenced by cultural expectations, not just biological factors. These categories like class, ethnicity, gender, and race are part of our identity and influence how we experience the world. A key term in cultural studies is subjectivity, which refers to the way people experience the world from their personal perspective. In cultural studies, culture is seen as a subjective form, meaning that it is experienced differently by each individual. This is important because it recognizes that everyone's experience of culture is unique, shaped by their own background and circumstances. Another important idea in cultural studies is questioning common sense. Common sense refers to the ideas and assumptions that seem obvious or natural to us. But these ideas are often shaped by cultural practices and power dynamics. Cultural studies encourages us to scrutinize these assumptions and question why we think certain things are normal or natural. Often these beliefs serve to maintain social inequalities by supporting existing power structures. One of the core areas of cultural studies is the study of ideology. Ideology refers to the set of beliefs or ideas that shape how we see the world and our place in it. These ideologies are not neutral, they often reflect the interests of powerful groups in society. For example, in Marxism, ideology is seen as a way for the ruling class to maintain power by shaping how people think about the world. Cultural studies looks at how ideologies influence our thinking and how they are reinforced through cultural products like media, literature, and education. Representation is another key concept in cultural studies. Representation refers to how things are presented or portrayed in culture. Whether it's people, ideas, or events, representation is not neutral or objective. It is always influenced by ideology and power. Some ways of thinking and representing are included, while others are excluded. Cultural studies explores how different groups are represented in culture and how these representations shape our understanding of the world. Stuart Hall, one of the key figures in cultural studies, introduced the concept of the circuit of culture to explain how culture works. The circuit of culture consists of 5 key components: representation, regulation, identity, consumption, and production. These components help us understand how culture is created, shared, and consumed. Representation refers to how something is portrayed. Regulation refers to the rules and norms that govern culture. Identity relates to how individuals see themselves within a culture. Consumption refers to how people use and engage with cultural products. And production is about how cultural products are created. A central concern in cultural studies is language. Language is the medium through which meaning is created and communicated. In cultural studies, language is seen as a system of signs and symbols that we use to make sense of the world. Understanding how language works is key to understanding culture, because language is the primary way we create and share meaning. Cultural studies also explores how meaning is produced through language and symbolic systems. Meaning is not fixed or absolute. It is created differences and relationships between signs. This idea comes from structuralism, a theory that suggests that culture works like a language. In this view, culture is made up of symbolic practices and meaning is created through the relationships between different cultural symbols. In cultural studies, there is no such thing as an objective truth. All knowledge is seen as a matter of representation, meaning that it is always shaped by the perspective of the person presenting it. This is why cultural studies focuses on subjectivity and how individuals experience and interpret the world. Representations are created by people in specific social and cultural contexts, and they are always influenced by power and ideology. Cultural studies also democratizes the study of culture by recognizing that culture is not just about high cultural forms like art and literature, but also about everyday practices and institutions like education and media. Cultural practices are part of everyday life, and they play a key role in creating meaning. By studying these practices, cultural studies helps us to understand how meaning is produced and shared in society. Another aspect of cultural studies is the focus on power and politics. Cultural studies examines how power operates in society, especially through language and representation. By looking at how things are described and talked about, cultural studies helps reveal the power dynamics behind cultural practices and ideas. This process of redescribing and re-signifying things helps challenge traditional ways of thinking and creates new ways of understanding the world. Cultural studies also looks at how national identities are created through language and symbols. Nations are not just political entities, they are also cultural constructs. For example, national flags and anthems are symbols that help create a sense of shared identity among people. Cultural studies explores how these symbols create a common imagination of the nation and how they are used to represent certain ideas about national identity. Science is seen as a cultural practice in cultural studies. Science is not just a neutral objective activity. It is also a way of understanding the world that is shaped by cultural values and assumptions. Science is viewed as a form of discourse, meaning that it uses language and symbols to create meaning. For example, when we describe ourselves as human beings using biological, we are using the language of science, which is itself shaped by cultural ideas. Cultural studies began as a response to traditional sociology, which often viewed culture in purely functional terms. For example, traditional sociology might look at the family as a well-functioning unit of society without considering the power dynamics within the family. Cultural studies challenges this approach by focusing on the ways in which power and politics influence cultural practices and institutions. It is a field that critically examines how cultural forms, institutions are shaped by power. Unlike traditional functionalist approaches that view culture as a system that naturally works to maintain order, cultural studies takes a suspicious view of this. It questions the role of science and technology in supporting the status quo and critiques how instrumental rationality is often used to keep things as they are without questioning deeper inequalities. In this sense, cultural studies offers a way to rethink the role of reason and rationality, accepting the useful parts of reason but also recognizing its limitations. One of the in cultural studies is power. Power gives certain groups or institutions the ability to shape knowledge, create official narratives, and establish what is considered common sense. Power is not just about political or physical control, it also influences how we see the world, form our identities, and understand our place in society. In cultural studies, power is closely linked to concepts like subjectivity, identity, and representation, all of which are imbued with power. Language plays a crucial role in this process. In cultural studies, language is seen as both a tool and a medium that can be used to resist power and reshape how we think about things. For instance, when we reframe the idea of family as not just a functional unit but also a place where power, identity, and subjectivity come into play, we are challenging the dominant traditional views of family life. This act of redescription is key to cultural studies as it seeks to rethink and reimagine cultural concepts in new ways. Investigating power is important because it helps us understand how dominant ways of thinking are legitimized and sustained. While some critics of cultural studies may see it as purely a theoretical or linguistic exercise, this field is also pragmatic. It looks at real-world cultural forms and institutions and understands them as anti-representational, meaning they don't provide a complete or accurate picture of reality. Instead, they offer provisional representations or snapshots of the world shaped by power and ideology. Cultural studies is not just about analyzing texts and discourses, but also about making a difference in the real world. It has a deep commitment to social reform and improving cultural policy. By studying how power operates in culture through things like language, media, and institutions, cultural studies aims to bring about change. It looks at issues like inequality, misrepresentation, and how certain groups are marginalized in society, and it seeks to use this knowledge to create a more just and equal world. One of the ways cultural studies achieves this is by focusing on discourses, structured systems of meaning that shape how we think about the world. These discourses are filled with ideology and influence everything from our morality to our daily practices. Understanding how discourses work allows us to see how power operates in society and gives us the tools to change the status quo. Cultural studies also takes a biocultural approach, recognizing that human beings are both biological and cultural creatures. Our cultural practices, forms, and institutions are shaped by human beings who are themselves products of their cultural environments. This means that our experiences, identities, and subjectivities are deeply tied to the cultural forms we interact with and are shaped by the representations we see in society. Cultural studies aims to contribute to social change by analyzing how meaning is constructed and how discourses and representations shape our understanding of the world. It seeks to expose the workings of power and bring about reform. This includes examining how media, for example, can perpetuate inequality by reinforcing certain ideas or ways of thinking. Through this analysis, cultural studies offers ways to challenge dominant representations and create new, more inclusive narratives. Cultural studies pays particular attention to forms of power related to gender, race, class, and colonialism. These categories are often used to maintain inequalities in society, and cultural studies works to explore and dismantle these systems of power. By doing so, it develops new ways of thinking about culture and power that can be used by individuals and groups who seek to bring about social change. In this field, subjectivity and identity are central concerns. Subjectivity refers to the condition of being a person, and it includes all the processes that shape our sense of self. Our subjectivity is influenced by the culture we live in, and it is through this lens that we come to understand ourselves as human beings. Similarly, identity is shaped by cultural factors like class, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. These aspects of identity are not just personal traits but are deeply connected to the cultural practices and expectations that surround us. Cultural studies also looks closely at common sense, which refers to the ideas and beliefs that seem natural or obvious to us. Often, common sense is tied to ideology and serves to uphold existing power structures. For example, ideas about gender roles or racial hierarchies may seem like common sense, but they are actually shaped by cultural ideologies that benefit certain groups over others. Cultural studies seeks to challenge these common sense beliefs, exposing the power dynamics that lie behind them. One of the key ways that power operates in society is through naming. Those in power get to name things and make those names stick, creating what becomes accepted as official or common sense knowledge. These descriptions shape how we see the world and legitimize certain ways of thinking while marginalizing others. Cultural studies aims to scrutinize these processes, challenging the official versions of reality and offering alternative ways of understanding. Studying discourse in cultural studies is crucial because discourse shapes what we see as truth. By analyzing how power is embedded in discourse, cultural studies helps us understand the flexibility of knowledge and opens the door to social and cultural change. Through redescribing and rethinking the habitual ways of thinking, cultural studies offers a path toward dismantling entrenched power structures and creating new, more equitable ways of living. Let me say this to conclude this discussion. Cultural studies is a powerful field that examines how culture is shaped by power, language, and representation. It is not just a theoretical exercise but a practical tool for bringing about social reform. By critically analyzing discourses and challenging common sense beliefs, cultural studies aims to create a more just and inclusive world.